Shavua Tov. We're continuing our study of the avoda of the Soyer HaMishtalech. And we're on page Ches, on the left column, and we spoke about a double machlokes. We had a machlokes as to whether or not hagrola makeves, which means that according to one opinion, the seirim could only be nikbaim, they could only be determined by a hagrola. In the absence of hagrola, if the Kohen Gadol decides that this one on his right is for Hashem and this one on his left is Hazazel, that won't cut the mustard. That's called hagrola makeves. And the other opinion says no, that the Kohen Gadol is the balabas. It's only a mitzvah to do hagrola, but hagrola is not critical. And then we had another debate that even if we hold hagrola eina makeves, does the Kohen Gadol have the ability to change the hagrola? Let's say the hagrola was done, even though it's not critical, and the Kohen Gadol made a decision that he wants to uproot the hagrola and change it, and that which was determined by the lottery to be Lashem, he wants it Lazazel, and vice versa. Does he have the power and the authority to do so? Then we had a discussion, which was the last thing that we touched upon at the end of the week, about mum. If there's a blemish in the Soyer HaMishtalech, or we had a case of mechusar zman, and we came to the conclusion that mum is a posel, even in the Soyer HaMishtalech. It's not being brought on the mizbeach at all. It's being sent over the precipice, but nevertheless, if it contracts a blemish, it is absolutely disqualified. And then we have a case of mechusar zman. And the last thing that we discussed was, what is mechusar zman in the case of the Soyer HaMishtalech? So let's just get back into this question so that we have it down packed. Mechusar zman, which disqualifies the Soyer HaMishtalech. So for this, we have a footnote. If you want to see it on the bottom, it's Kuf Nun Beis. And he gives two scenarios, two possibilities of mechusar zman. The first one was that the Soyer was less than 8 days old since its birth. And he says that ofen ze lo yitzuyer ba'avar rishona shel shnei asirim. He says that this would not be a possible psul because the din of hagrola, according to the Yom hagrola makeves, means that we have to have both a Soyer Lashem and a Soyer Lazazel, and two goats that are identical are both candidates for this hagrola. If only one of them is a candidate, then hagrola becomes meaningless. Now, the Soyer Lashem is a classic carbon that's brought on the mizbeach, and it requires 8 days since the animal was born. So if you're talking about mechusar zman as a Soyer, which is less than 8 days old, then the entire process of hagrola, the lottery would be impossible, would be invalid. And you don't need a psul of mechusar zman. Basically, since it's mechusar, right, because the two serum are identical, they are the same age, and if they're less than 8 days old, then the Soyer Lashem would be possible. The Soyer Lashem is possible, then ipso facto, the Soyer Lazazel can't be kosher because there's no hagrola, and we're holding now that hagrola makeves. So therefore, we have to come up with another possible scenario of a psul of mechusar zman in the Soyer HaMishtalech. And he says the following: Yitzuyer psul zeh b'ofen sheviu shnei seirim kedin. They did hagrola on two seirim. Kedin means everything was perfect. There was no possible disqualification. Then v'chilalu, what they did was they transferred the kedusha from the sa'ir to another sa'ir. In other words, they took a third sa'ir and they did a transfer of kedusha. That's called a chilul. And now there's a replacement sa'ir. And the replacement sire is mechusas man. It is less than 8 days old. So as far as Hagrola is concerned, that at the moment of Hagrola, everything was perfect. And both Seirim were candidates. They were both born more than 8 days, at least 8 days ago. But if they did a chilul after the Hagrola, and they brought in from the bullpen another sire to replace the sire that was chosen originally, and now you have a Sarah Mishtalech that's going to be a replacement for the original Sarah Mishtalech. If the replacement Sarah Mishtalech is less than 8 days old, then it's possible. And for that, we need a special Gzeres HaKosuv that the psulim that apply to a carbon on the Mizbeach in an Avodas Pnim apply to the Avodas Chutz in the case of the Sarah Mishtalech. Number 2. What happens if on that very same day, the mother of this Sa'ir, in other words, the Se'ira, the female, was shechted? And the Torah says, Oso velo oso vesbino. The Torah prohibits a shechita on the same day of both a mother animal and its offspring. In this case, the Sarah Mishtalech cannot be subject to shechita because its mother was slaughtered on this very day. However, we're not interested in slaughtering the Sarah Mishtalech. The Sarah Mishtalech is sent over the precipice. There's no shechita. But the answer is there's a separate psul in the case of lo yishchad oso vespino b'yom echad that would apply to the Sarah Lashem, which is brought on the Mizbeach and needs shechita, obviously. And we're enjoined from doing the shechita because we shechted the mother on this day. And that psul is now grafted onto the Sarah HaMishtalech. This, despite the fact that the Sarah HaMishtalech doesn't need shechita. Now, what's the deal if the Sarah HaMishtalech is a treifa? In other words, it has some sort of injury to one of its vital internal organs. And it's the sheet of the Rambam in Hilchas Avodas Yom Kippurim Perek Hey that if the animal, which was now designated and determined to be a Sarah Mishtalech after the Hagrola was completed, it became a treifa, it had some sort of fall, and it was injured in a way that it won't survive, it is possible as a Sarah Mishtalech. You're going to have to find a replacement Sarah Mishtalech. Why? Because the Torah says, Ya'amad Chai, that both Seirim have to be set up, standing there in the Azor at the time of the Hagrola, alive. And that L'chora is Allah at the time of the Hagrola. The Rambam extends this to apply evenly Achar Hagrola, that the din of Chai, which means that the animal has the ability to live and there's nothing internally that would bring about its death and guarantee that it would die within 12 months, that applies even after the Hagrola. That's the big chiddush of the Rambam. All Rishonim understood that Yom Ad Chai, the halacha, the requirement of Chai applies to the Shas Hagrola. What happens to the animal, which is designated as Sarah Mishtalech after the Hagrola, is irrelevant. And even if it's a treifa, we'll send it over the precipice. But the Rambam comes up with a chiddush that the halacha of Yom Ad Chai is not just a condition in the Hagrola at the moment of the Hagrola, but it also applies in general as far as the Sarah Mishtalech being kosher for its avodas chutz. and it must be chai, which means it cannot be a treifa. So that's another example of a psul that would apply normally to avodas pnim, and we're going to extend it to avodas chutz in the case of the Sarah Mishtalim. Now we get to the actual avodas chutz of the Sarah Mishtalim. Li'achar agrola. Now we get to what's called the lashon shel zahuris, the scarlet. How do you say in English? Ribbon, scarlet ribbon that is kosher, that is tied down to the neck of the Sarah Mishtaleh. What do we know about this ribbon? Number one, we know it's zahuris. Zahuris means it is tzavua, it's tzemer, it's made of wool, and it's dyed a certain kind of scarlet color, a reddish color. And it has to be saruk, which means you have to comb it. Of course, when you take wool off the back of the sheep, it's all tangled up. And you want to make a ribbon out of it, you have to untangle it. That's called srika, to be sorek. And if we were learning Masechta Shabbos, Perika Oreg, we would talk about which malacha you would violate on Shabbos if you did srika. But this was not done on Shabbos or on Yom Kippur. This was done way in advance. What other conditions apply to the lashon shel zahuris? Because all the kapara is going to be indicated and inherent in the lashon shel zahuris. It's got to be mishkal shnei sloim. This is a sugya later on in Masechta Yoma on Daf Lamites, going on all the way to Daf Mem Beis. And the sela was used as an indication of a weight, because it wasn't just that it was sealed by the government, but it also had to have a certain weight to it. And the weight of this ribbon had to be shnei sloim. Now, where was this ribbon tied to? A lot of this we know from the Seder Avodah that we recite in the Machzor on Yom Kippur. The Rosh Seir HaMishtaleach bein shtei pranav. It was on the head of the goat, between its horns. And it was tied down to the horns of the animal. And Makom Kshira Zu Ishtana Bervos Hashanim. Rishona Koshim Lashon Shel Zuz Al Pesach Ha'ula Mibachutz. The original procedure was that at the entrance into the Heichal, which is called the Ulam, at that entranceway, they would already tie down the Lashon Shel Zahuris onto the head of the animal. Later on, and I'm going to try to understand why they made this takana, they actually took the soyer inside the Heichal, entering through the gate of the Ulam into the Heichal, and that's where they tied it down to the head of the soyer. And this is a sugya in Yoma on Daf Samach Zayin. And we'd have to spend quite a bit of time. The Gemara says that in the original takana, that they tied it down at the doorway, at the entranceway into the Ulam. Hilbin ayu smechim lo, hilbin ayu atzavim umisbaishim. In other words, you know that I don't have to tell you that the result of the process of Sarah Lazazel was well known by the people, and it indicated whether or not Hashem accepted the Sawyer and was mechaper on Klal Yisrael. And that all depended on whether the other part of this ribbon would turn white. If it turned white, Kishela Gelbinu, then that was a miraculous revelation from on high that we had achieved kapara. If it didn't turn white, it was very sad. And Chazal wanted to establish that this would not happen, because in the Beis Hamikdash, they didn't want any sort of atzmus, of sadness. So what they did was, Hiskinu, they made a takana, Kodshim al Pesach ulam mibifnim, inside the ulam. Now, could the people see what would go on with this lashon shel zahuris if it was inside the heichal? Adayin hayu mitzitzim v'roim. Since the entranceway, the gateway into the heichal was open, they could still peer in and see whether it turned white or red, or stayed red. So now we get to round number 3. Iskidu, they made another takana. You coaching also chetzio besela v'chetzio bein karnov. That they took the ribbon, and at one end of the ribbon, they tied it to a boulder at the precipice, and the other end of the ribbon was tied to the head of the soil. And now, apparently, the reaction of the people had to be suspended until they would find out the results, because they no longer had that part of the ribbon inside the Beis Hamikdash, so that we couldn't take the Sawyer all the way into the Kosh Kodshim. In the best scenario, maybe we could take it into the opening of the Heichal, but then the people could see through the gateway the shar of the ulam, and they could know and have one of those two reactions. Now, so there was one lashon shel zahuris, which was tied down, as we said, between the horns of the goat. V'chein haya kosher chut nosaf b'tzavoro shel hasoyer she'ola l'Hashem. Now, there was another rope, and it's not clear exactly whether the requirements that apply to the lashon shel zahuris, which was tied around the head of the Soyer Mishtalech, would apply also to this additional chut, which was tied around the neck of the Soyer Lashem. So there was a clear-cut distinction between the Soyer Lazazel and the Soyer Lashem. The Soyer Lazazel was a scarlet ribbon, and the Soyer Lashem had around it a chut, not a scarlet ribbon. Kidei shelo yisarev im seir hamusafim shaya omed gam ba'azara. There was, in addition to the Soyer Lashem, which was part of the pair of two Seirim, Lashem Lazazel, there was also a Sar that was brought in Musaf. And in order to make sure that we didn't make any confusion between those two Seirim, they would tie a chut around the neck of the Sar Lashem. Now the Kohen goes over to the Sar Mishtaleach. He places his hands over the head of the Sar and he recites Vidui. That confession is on behalf of the entire community of Israel. And then after Vidui, he would send the Sar Mishtaleach beyond each iti. Iti means a designated person who stood with him in the Azora and now would take over the Sar and bring it out to the Tzuk, to the precipice where it would be sent. So that's why the Sar is called the Sar HaMishtalech. Mishtalech means it was sent in the hands of a proxy, of a shliach, who represented the Kohen Gadol, because all the avodah of Yom Kippur has to be done by the Kohen Gadol. But in the case of sending the Sar outside the Mikdash, the Kohen Gadol was not allowed to exit the Mikdash. He gave it over to a proxy who represented him. And Shlucho Shaladim Kimoso, it's as if the Kohen Gadol himself did the avodas hachutz of pushing the Sar over the edge. So that's called the Sar HaMishtalech. Who is this Ish Iti? Kosher Af B'Yisrael, El Shenogu Bezin Shel Kohen V'Sholcha B'Yad Kohen. The minig was to choose as an Ish Iti a Kohen, 2 points for the Kohenim, even though technically you don't need a Kohen. He's not doing an avoda, but the minig was that a Kohen should do the shiluach. Ishtaleach biyad Kohen. He would walk together with the Sar ad shegiya lahar, until he reached a mountaintop, Tzuk, a precipice, Az, very sharp, Kosher, and it was solid, Sheba Midbar, out in the desert. But you know what? It's Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur in Eretz Yisrael is pretty hot, usually. And the Ish Iti, the Shliach, has not drunk, he hasn't eaten, and now you're sending him on a long trek from the Beis HaMikdash, from the Azora, with the Sar all the way out to the Tzuk. Is him nechlash if he gets weak, b'yeis halichaso, mutter b'machal u'b'mishta. They set up booths along the way, and the Mishnayos will talk about the distance between one booth and the other. Sukkos hochivulo, and in every sukkah, there was food and drink prepared. They would stop, the Ish Iti on his way to the Tzuk would stop at each one of these stations, and they would ask him, are you weak? And if he said yes, they would give him food and drink. Now here we have an insight of Rav Moshe Soloveitchik, Zichron Livroch, my Rebbe's father. Rav Moshe asked, eating and drinking on Yom Kippur is a violation of an Isur Kares. The other Inuyim are not, but Achil and Shasiya, V'nisam es nafshesech, v'nefesh shelo su'una b'yom hazeh, v'nichus ha'nefesh ha'imei ameh, is a Chiv Kares. Why are we overriding a Chiv Kares for the sake of the Sar HaMishtalech? And he says the following: L'chora, what we know about overriding the Shabbos for the sake of a korban, all the Shabbos b'Shabbato, applies to the malachos of Shabbos. and we will violate malachas of Shabbos for the sake of an avoda. But here we're violating the Isra Achila and Shasiyah. How do we know? Where did the Mishnah derive this premise from? That just like we override the Isra Malach of Shabbos for the sake of avoda, we likewise will override the Isra Kares of Achila and Shasiyah on Yom Kippur for the sake of the avoda. Meaning, if the Ish Iti is incapable because he's very weak of finishing this mitzvah and doing the shiluach minatzuk, the chiyaso minatzuk, we will allow him to eat or drink on Yom Kippur. Where do we know this from? And Rav Moshe came up with a fantastical chiddush. He said that what we derive from Olas Shabbos b'Shabbato, the overriding of Shabbos, is not for the particular avoda, but rather what we're saying is that the Kedusha of Shabbos will be overridden for the sake of the avoda. Not Melecha Shabbos, but Kedusha Shabbos. In the case of Yom Kippur, not Melechas Yom Kippur, but rather Kedushas Yom Kippur. We will desecrate the Kedusha of Yom Kippur for the sake of the avoda. In this case, the avoda's chutz of the Sar Mishtalech. If it's necessary, we will violate the Kedusha Sayom. Says Rav Moshe, the Kedusha Sayom of Yom Kippur has two different dimensions, but they're all generated by the Kedusha Sayom. One is the Yisur Malacha, and the other is Achila Shtiyah. All these prohibitions emanate from the very same source, the essence of the day, the Kedusha Sayom. The Tzuma Shal Yom Yom Kippur expresses itself in both the Yisur Malacha and the Yisur Achila and Shasiyah, but it's all one and the same. And if we will override the Kedusha and desecrate the Kedusha of Yom Kippurim for the sake of the avoda, and do Malacha for the sake of them, then by the same token, we will override the Kedusha of Yisur Achila Shasiyah, which is one and the same in its fundamental beginnings as the Yisur Malacha. So if the Yisur Malacha is overridden, then ipso facto, the Yisur Achila and Shasiyah is overridden. And now we're up to the Chiyaso Litzuk, which is on the next page here. We now are up to the actual avoda of pushing the Sayar HaMishtaleach over the Tzuk. And believe me, there, the details of that avoda will pick up tomorrow. So let's just make a note of where we got up to here on the top of page Yud Zayin.